Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 279th New Social Environment. I'm Sophia Pedlow, the Managing Director here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure of being your MC today for a conversation between William Kentridge and Charles Shafaieh. As a special treat, Kit Schluter is coming in hot from Mexico City to close out today's program with some of his poems. We'd like to thank Marion Goodman Gallery for supporting today's conversation. You can explore William Kentridge's social exhibition, Making Prints, Selected Editions 1998 to 2021 in the gallery's online viewing room. Check out the chat for those links. We start all of our events with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in Brooklyn, we are on the unceded land and waters of Lenape-Hoking, which still belongs to the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second acknowledgement is that Black Lives Matter. We recognize the legacy of settler colonialism as part of the many contemporary expressions of white supremacy. We honor those that have lost their lives to this violence. I encourage you all to check out the chat for a living document of resources and actions as we all do our part in the learning and unlearning required to undo this legacy of injustice. Now to introduce today's guest and host. William Kentridge was born in 1955 in Johannesburg, South Africa, where he currently lives and works. His process of recording history is constructed from reconfigured fragments to arrive at a provisional understanding of the past. His work spans a diverse range of artistic media, such as drawing, performance, film, printmaking, sculpture, and painting. Kentridge has also directed a number of acclaimed operas and theatrical productions. And originally from Montana and now based in New York City, Charles Shafaieh, writing on theater, visual art, literature, film, and music, has appeared in numerous international publications. He is an editor-at-large here at the Brooklyn Rail, and I'm very pleased to hand over the mic. Welcome.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you to everyone joining. And can everybody, I wonder if, Sophia, could you thumbs up if you can hear me?
Yeah, we got you live.
Great. So thank you, William, and thank you to the Rail for wonderful opportunity to chat with William from Johannesburg. It's a very international crowd today, which we're hoping to focus on William's theatrical output, which in his, as we'll discuss, is not separate from any of his other work. But I thought that perhaps intriguing for people who don't know his work, and even for people who do know his work, a place to start is some topic that he speaks about often, is failure. And as somebody who as accomplished as William, I think people would be surprised how he's defined himself elsewhere as his career as a series of productive failures, I think he said. And so I'm, and in one instance in particular, that he had to fail at acting in order to return to the studio, but also in a way to fail at acting in order to act. And so I was hoping that maybe you could start by addressing the importance of failure, whether that's artistically or outside of the studio. And then we could take that to the Lecoq School after that.
So I think one can, hi, Charles, lovely to be with you and everybody from Brooklyn Rail across the many, many miles and oceans. I have spoken about failure, but it's never really to celebrate it. You know, I think that one can always write one's biography or one's trajectory as being rescued by one's failures. All the things which you might have done, which you haven't done, which have allowed you to arrive where you are. I mean, the failures I had, and let's list them. When I started being a painter, when I started being an artist, to be an artist, you needed to paint with oil paint on canvas in Johannesburg in the 1970s. That's what it was to be an artist. And certainly I failed at oil painting. I was rescued by discovering charcoal and graphics and monochromatic work, whether it's drawing or printmaking. And I gave up being an artist. I thought I'd failed as an artist. And I went to study acting in Paris. I thought, well, then I'll become an actor. I'd acted in student productions. I'd been at the edges of professional acting in Johannesburg and thought, well, then I should really study it. And I went to Paris to study theater, and I discovered after 3 weeks I was not an actor. and failed at that. But also failed at it comprehensively enough to feel, okay, this is not something I should be doing. If I'd been slightly less bad as an actor, I might have continued with it and thought, oh God, why am I never getting decent roles? Why am I always the third sword bearer? And then I tried to work in various other fields, like in filmmaking. And that was so depressing, the South African film scene in the 1980s, that I gave that up. But each of those, let it be said, is a painful failure. I really wanted to be a painter. And it was a difficult admission to say, I should not be a painter. I really wanted to be an actor and thought I could be an actor. So when it was clear I couldn't be, it's not a glib failure. It was felt as a catastrophic existential failure. Okay, I don't know what I'm going to do if I can't. And when the films that I wanted to make were clear were never going to happen, I was sort of defeated and found that I was reduced to being an artist again, back in the studio. And only in years later did I realize how lucky I was that I'd had the year at theatre school, because that came into the work, and the time working in the film industry, because it made me more confident working with film. And in the end, I saw that all these different strands which I'd failed at were in fact very useful exercises or parts of the formation of what the work I do in the studio, which is now allowed to shift between purely visual arts, performance, opera, everything except oil painting. There the failure remains complete. Although I do have a friend two friends in Italy who teach painting, and we were there one summer, I was there with my family, and they said, let's teach you, this is ridiculous, we're gonna give you lessons in oil painting. And they did, they showed me how to lay out the palette, how to mix different tones. And I discovered that I could quite enjoy being a Sunday painter. It was something that I kind of enjoyed, but it felt utterly removed and utterly different from the activity of being an artist. So the failure was, in retrospect, a series of useful dead ends, but it's not something to, I mean, I am glib about it, but it's not something to be glib about.
Sure, it's not a celebration of failure.
But in retrospect, it may be, but at the time, it's certainly not. And it's not something one aims for, but in truth, also, when a drawing is really going badly, when a drawing goes really well, you get, or work that you're going on, you get more and more anxious about spoiling what you've done, and you keep looking backwards at the good work that you've done. And one becomes generally more tight and cautious. When the work is clearly off the, not working, off the rails, as it progresses, it gives one a freedom to say, all right, this drawing's not working, let's literally tear it up into 4 pieces and then start rearranging those 4. Let's work with a big brush and fat black ink and move onto it with a lot of vehemence, which you wouldn't allow yourself if the initial work had been very precise or elegant or made you pleased with it. So there are also things within the artistic process of things going wrong, which is one of the strategies of finding things to surprise yourself. Gestures, constructions, images. And that's always the question, finding a strategy for work to emerge.
And the gesture, I mean, even just now watching you speak, it's a very gestural language, and the gestures of tearing the papers can be traced back in some way to the Lecoq School in Paris, of the act of, as you've spoken about before, of the physical energy required to create a work. And I'm curious if it's something that I've noticed as I've interviewed Alejandro Jodorowsky recently as well, and Robert Wilson in this series in December, and Willem Dafoe in that same conversation, that there's an affinity in Jodorowsky's case. He started off in mime and worked with Marcel Marceau. And so there's a continuation of this, even in the late 20th and early 21st century, of the avant-garde and the physical body being held as primacy. And I'm curious if that education in that school, how that informed your overall practice, but also this sense of embodiment largely.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly learned more about drawing from the year I spent at theatre school. It was clear after 3 weeks that I should not be a professional actor on the basis that everything I did felt very much the same. The good students would show you a new character each time they were embodying something new, and for me it always became the same. But it was a very rigorous course with every half hour planned, and there were exercises, and the exercises like piano exercise, things you do again and again and again and again, the way you would practice scales, not because you're going to be a performer of scales in the rest of your life, but because there's a learning in the body of what that gesture can be that informs so many other things. So, I mean, to give you an example, we do an exercise where you simply bend down and touch your toes, and then in one movement, stand upright. And you think, well, okay, that's a very banal physical exercise, but it was about what is the energy needed in that first impulse such that it will take you upright and not be too strong that you have to stop yourself going past, or too weak that you have to push yourself the last few inches, which is an exercise about what is the origin of something that you're going to see much later. The heart of it is much later. And whether that's a mark you're making on a sheet of paper, the impulse of a brush in ink and across the sheet of paper, or an actor on stage turning around to talk to someone, or in fact, the nature of a voice coming out or a breath. They're all things that have to do with what is the energy inside a moment that is going to have meaning, that won't be either pushed further or have to be stopped and rearranged. What is the heart of it? And it was a theater school. It was not a mime school like Marcel Marceau, where you learn or how to hold a balloon and things like that. But it was a school without language. It was about what is the meaning the body gives before language is added, before you find psychology. What is the sense of understanding of the world, and if you like, the psychology that comes from watching a body in movement. So there'd be very specific exercise. And if I teach drawing, which I very occasionally do, generally 90% of the exercises I give the artists to make, or the art students to make, are exercises from Lecoq, acting exercises from Lecoq. And they're very specific. I mean, to give an example, if we spend 2 minutes on this, there's an exercise about different degrees of tension in your body. And so you divide it into 7 or 5 different degrees of tension, from being where there's no energy at all, which would come with a kind of breath and a voice, to a second level, which is just relaxed. It would be, again, a different way of talking, allowing things to slur and moving easily, to a third level, which might be completely neutral, mechanical. You move and there's no from A to B, and when you reach B, you stop. So you can go from no energy to a relaxed energy to a neutral energy. To a fourth level might be an impulse. You move from A to B because you want to go to A to B. There's a different energy in your body, in your voice. To a fifth level where there's a kind of passion, a kind of commedia dell'arte, where everything is exaggerated, where there's emphasis, where you can understand. And then you can practice these and learn these as an exercise, and then you can play it. Okay, let's change from third gear to first gear to fourth gear to sixth gear, to no theater, being Japanese no theater, when you're at the most tense degree possible, where you're so tense you can hardly. So these are theater exercises, but which can also inform the way you make a mark, from a kind of really relaxed movement to a neutral movement, to an impulse, and it immediately frees, if you're doing it with students, so suddenly they get a whole new vocabulary of drawing. And the thing also is understanding how, even if it's a mark you're making on paper, how it's rooted in the body. Whether you're making a mark that is an entire body that's moving, or if you're just drawing from the shoulder, or if you're just drawing from the elbow, or just from the wrist, or if you're very cautious, just with the knuckles. So, sorry, there's a very long answer to the way in which exercises in theater, or thinking about theater and the body in theater, also come into thinking about the body in the studio.
That's very interesting. I appreciate the long answer. One thing that it brings to mind is a production that you've directed at least on 2 occasions, I believe. And you've said this word, and I've said this word already in the conversation, Catastrophe. by Beckett, the very short late Beckett work, which you directed this back in the 80s, is that correct?
Yes.
And then again, I see it with Less Good Idea more recently.
Yes, correct.
It seems a very kind of a way in which we could almost talk about so much of your work in the context of this very sculptural play, short play. You could describe the very short action that takes place and maybe the manipulations of the body that take place in this production and its ways of dramatizing process in many aspects.
The Catastrophe was one of the last plays that Samuel Beckett wrote. It's one of the most overtly political. It was written in solidarity for Václav Havel, who at that stage was imprisoned or certainly under state control in the Czech Republic, and later, of course, he became the president, the first president in the democratic Czech Republic after the end of the Soviet Union. And Amnesty International was given the rights to control the performance of the play, and Penn in South Africa asked me to do a production of it. I mean, although Beckett is interesting, and one of the things we do at the center is re-look at Beckett and see the politics inside Beckett rather than just the existentialism. I mean, it's interesting that he did the translation of a whole series of essays, French essays, about Africa in the 1950s. So there are very interesting things sideways about Beckett. But this is a very simple play in 3 pages. There's a man with his head bowed in shadow on a plinth. There's a director and a secretary, and the director gives instructions to the secretary to adjust the person, close the jacket, add more ash to his head, move the hand, show the hand out of his pocket. And the secretary goes backwards and forwards between the director and the person or the shadow on a plinth. You're not sure if it's a sculpture or a real person at that stage. She makes a few suggestions. She says, well, what about a little gag? The director says, a little gag. Do you want to dot every I and cross every T? Don't be ridiculous. Little gag, don't be crazy. Just add a bit more ash. She says, I make a note, more ash. And at the end, the director goes to the back of the stage. He says, all right, put the lights down, put the lights down, put the lights down. Right. Says, let them have it. And the lights come on the figure, and the figure just is completely still, and in this tiny light on its face, it just slowly lifts his head to stare at the audience. So it takes 2 pages of text and about 20 minutes to perform. And it's kind of Beckett at his most perfect. Every line is both funny and appropriate and revealing, and it's completely cruel and kind of redemptive in that last moment of that look in which suddenly the audience is in the position of the director who has controlled this event. And so I had done it 40 years ago. And when we started the Center for the Less Good Idea, a small art center in Johannesburg, 5 or 6 years ago, in the first season of productions we had a small season of Beckett plays. And this was one of the ones we redid, which was a kind of a real pleasure to revisit.
There's something a bit funny about the play, and odd in the way that I thought also connected to your work, in the sense that the director constantly seems to have forgotten what he's already done. And you wonder if he was the director who came and already had made the decisions about the object on the plinth, or if he wasn't, who was. And so this idea of not having control over your own production, which I thought resonated.
I mean, there are different echoes. On the one hand, I made an animated film called Monument, which in a way was an animated version of Catastrophe, a statue on a plinth that's being demonstrated or being presented to the public. And the last image of the film, the statue raises his head, a kind of a mute resistance. And I thought, oh, this was the connection with Catastrophe, but then it was pointed out, in fact, by Rosalind Krauss, a fellow New Yorker critic who'd looked at the film and read the play and said, no, in fact, the similarity was more between me and the director, because the director is constantly doing this movement, seeing what he's made and then adjusting it, almost like an animation, erasing what the position of the hand, moving the hand again, shifting the head, tilting it down, as if he's animating this figure. To all of these things, I mean, I suppose the great thing about a great work like Catastrophe is that it's endlessly productive of associations which come out of it, which one can latch onto. Either the way that you described, or the way that Rosalind Krauss described, or the way that it had struck me. And it's a question of being given enough information to provoke you into trying to complete a meaning, rather than everything, not dotting every I and crossing every T, not feeling you have to stick a little gag in its mouth, not to be too obvious.
Nothing is gagged, in a sense,
Yeah.
in this gag of another way. I wonder to talk a little bit more about the center, because not everybody listening will understand about that. Could you explain the name, where that comes from?
Yeah. So the Center for the Less Good Idea is an art center in downtown, in the kind of quite a rough part of Johannesburg. It's next to where I have a second studio. I'm speaking to you from my studio in the garden of my house, big leafy garden in the suburbs of Johannesburg. But there's the second studio downtown where sculpture and rehearsals and filming happens. And allied to that is the Center for the Less Good Idea. And it's called the Center for the Less Good Idea. It echoes a Tswana proverb, African proverb, which is, if the good doctor can't cure you, find the less good doctor. And it has different sets of meanings, or different sets of provocations in it. The one is that one starts every project with an idea, with a concept. This is going to be a play about. This is going to be the initial image. And it's not denying that you need a starting point, but what it's saying is that in the process of making something, whether it's in the studio or in the recording studio or in the dance studio or on the stage, so many things occur on the periphery, at the edges of what you thought your main idea was. And suddenly you see something that excites a new idea, a new thought. An idea from the periphery comes into the center and shifts what you thought you were doing. And so the center is a place of making which privileges that way of working. So no one writes a proposal before work is done. Nobody has to write the essay before the piece is made. There's a collaboration across different forms, choreographers working with video makers, working with performers, working with writers in many, many different ways. There have been, I think, 530 different actors, performers, writers, dancers who've done projects at the center in the last 5 years. And some of them have not worked, as you can imagine, when you have this kind of improvisatory work. There's some which are calamitous. But there have been some which have been completely ravishing and would not have emerged if they'd started in a different way. But there's also a sense of saying the huge ideas of the world, the grand philosophical, political ideas, have all been calamitous. And one needs to start with ideas on the periphery, at the edge, the way Johannesburg is at the periphery of the artistic world, of the political world, and say that nonetheless, from the periphery, ideas come in which can inform and shift the conversation in the center. So it's both about strategies of making, but it also has other thoughts in it. So it has to be a place of allowing uncertainty and doubt, and a safe space for both stupidity and failure, where an impulse can be given the benefit of the doubt and see what emerges from it. And sometimes nothing does, but if nothing does, it refers more to the people doing it than to what's in the material. There's almost very few things that are so bad that there isn't a kernel in it that can spark a set of ideas. So we have 2 seasons a year when we don't have COVID. Our last year's seasons are postponed to the end of this year when we hope we can do them, although we are having small performances at the moment. And different curators are invited to put together each season. And they invite the different actors, artists, projects, which I think would be interesting to show to people in Johannesburg. And at the end of 6 months, we have a few days of a kind of festival. So that's, and then there are many other things that the center does, but that's kind of the heart of it. And so I'm there sometimes as a curator, I've been there as a performer, been there as a director, but one of many, many people who keep it going.
I mean, that kind of excess of participants and possibilities and an intentional curation of mass, but without an objective from the start, correct? Is that important?
Well, there's an objective. Each season usually has a theme. We did one season, a very beautiful season, about the expanded or the exploded lecture. What are ways of not using the traditional lecture form to explain things in the world? What are the ways of using the traditional form to show the limits of that form itself? So there were anti-lectures, there were non-lectures, there were different kinds. We had a season about working from existing texts. And the season, we don't do a season, but we do a series of performances and a conversation about Franz Kafka at the end of this week, which is a bit like the Beckett, taking one writer and having 4 or 5 small, it sort of privileges the short form different fragments. So there's a theme somewhere at the beginning of a season, which is followed more or less closely depending on where the participants want to go with it. And so although there's never an agenda given either to a curator or the performers, it's interesting how cumulatively it becomes a very interesting portrait of Johannesburg and South Africa. It's local. The performers and the work we do is almost entirely of mainly Johannesburg, otherwise performers from South Africa and participants. We did one season which was 11-minute epics. The guiding principle was that everything would be 11 minutes long. And some were very political, some were completely apolitical. But cumulatively, it was a great portrait of the city over the 40 different productions.
We'll continue on with what you've just mentioned about lectures in a second, but to continue on about this locality aspect, I thought it was important to address a little bit about the ways in which doing Beckett in particular in terms of a theatrical context, but Kafka as well, this idea of taking what the avant-garde tradition from Europe mainly, which you've worked with a lot, and how it's being funneled and changed in Johannesburg, whether or not you want to, that could be described as the Johannesburg avant-garde or a South African avant-garde more broadly, but how it makes me think of a text by Columbia University professor Hamid Dabashi, who wrote a book about the ways in which Persian literature, the book is called Persophilia, how Persian literature was moved around the world and went into Europe. They treated it as they had read it, but even their translations of those texts then went back to Iran, and the Iranians changed it again and used it contrary to how the Europeans had translated it. And so this kind of fugitive nature of translations and texts. So how doing Beckett inside Johannesburg is, you're not parroting a French Beckett or a British Beckett or an Irish Beckett.
I don't think so. I mean, that's just also to give a shape. These 2 fragments that I've talked about are based on great European texts, but there are others. The main project I work on in the next season comes out of a Cameroonian novel, a French novel called La Vie d'un Boy, Houseboy, which is a wonderful 1950s novel, which for me, in one short novel, encapsulates so much about the paradoxes of colonialism. And most of the work that's done by the participants is not, in fact, based on great European texts. But there is always an enormous inflection given by it being made in Johannesburg. I mean, having done workshops with students in different parts of the world, with actors from other places in the theater, there's an extraordinary ease of physical proximity and movement amongst a large number of the actors that we work with. That the physicality of the pieces is so infused with where the people come from, with its terroir, one could say. And musically, of course, there's an enormously strong South African musical tradition, vocal tradition. Choirs at schools in South Africa are almost like football teams are in American high schools. So there's an extraordinary richness to work with and skill to work with in a lot of the work that's done. So there's an easy shift between movement, voice, acting, text, and music. And so a lot of the projects that I've done, which have involved music, the performers themselves are part of the composing team. There's often a composer, but very often composers I've worked with have worked with the singers, not just as performers, but as the fundus, as the source of finding different pieces of music that we're going to work with. I mean, for me, there's a question of modernism and the avant-garde, which still intrigues me. And that is, you had a kind of, this is particularly in the visual arts, where you had a strand of modernism, the traditional strand we all were taught through art history of the Impressionists, the post-Impressionists, the Expressionists, the Fauves to Matisse, and then Matisse's discoveries jumping across the Atlantic at the time of the Second World War to become the New York School of Painting, which under Clement Greenberg becomes the apotheosis of Western painting, the place where Western painting has to go, where it's all about canvas and edge and surface and painting about painting. And that's certainly the art history that I was taught at school and at university. And it took a lot to unlearn it. And that unlearning a lot had to do with this political situation in South Africa, where the art which was so raffiné, which was so refined that it had removed itself from any question in the world, became an absurdity in the context of South Africa. So I looked for strands of modernism that didn't end up evading the human, the social, the political. And those went through routes like the Russian avant-garde, Mayakovsky, Max Beckmann, the Neue Sachlichkeit, in America to people like the later work of Philip Guston, which has now obviously spawned a whole enormous body of work. But the circumstances in the 80s and 70s were very different. And so in that sense, there was a pressure to find a modernism, if you like, an avant-garde. The school that I went to, the painting school I went to in Johannesburg, the American color field painting was the direction that everybody was kind of set on. So it was a resistance against that, to say, no, let us find something that's not a conservative academic way of working, but that doesn't assume the alternative to that has to be pure paint and pure canvas, that one can still find a way in which the world can come into the work.
Is there an importance that in South Africa, whether or not your experience or people working at the center or the artists that you collaborate with, not having the baggage of some of the history that you younger people maybe, and have, it makes me think again of Beckett, of him shifting to writing to French to remove the emotional baggage, whether this is the historical baggage of the art traditions or just even the associations that people might have with these texts, with these artworks.
I think that's an interesting point. I mean, I realize now, if I look back, most of the theatrical work I've done has been based on work not in English, which have worked with either in its original language, in the operas or song cycles. But for example, I've never thought of doing a Shakespeare, directing a Shakespeare. But I've been very happy to do a Buchner, the Wozzeck, or the Wedekind, the Lulu operas, or the Winterreise of Schubert. And there's something about the freedom that comes of being outside of a tradition or at the edges of a tradition and not being weighed down by the knowledge of it. So when I did Buchner, I mean, a lot of German people said, how could you take on Buchner? Everybody knows the play so well. everybody knows all the famous different productions. I said, well, in Johannesburg, there was one production when I was a child, but after that, there's been none. It's an unknown play. No one knows it. It's completely new. One can do what one's liked with it. One doesn't feel the weight of previous generations. It's the way I would with Shakespeare. I would assume, well, the Royal Shakespeare Company has learnt and taught a way of declaiming, of parsing, of understanding the nature of the dramaturgy of Shakespeare. And I can't pretend I'm going to learn that or know that. So I need something which gives me much more freedom and less anxiety about feeling a provincial poltroon, not understanding what should be done. But I think there's also something which, I think it was Milan Kundera who once said that every great tradition is best understood from people outside. So you get Cervantes writing Don Quixote, but it's Lawrence Sterne with Tristram Shandy who takes that tradition further. And then it's Gogol who takes Tristram Shandy and translates it into Russia. So the idea that only if you're inside a tradition do you have the right to work with it has always seemed to me a kind of absurdity. There's always a bastardization of tradition. One needs to celebrate impurity. One needs to celebrate mistranslation. And particularly in South Africa, all questions of identity politics are always so loaded and so dangerous. We spend all these years fighting against a politics based on identity. And I'm very wary when it rears its head, even in the most progressive form.
Not only do you not focus on texts that were originally written in English, but to bring it back to the lecture conversation from the center, that you also, in the case of Kurt Schwitter's Ursinate, in a language which cannot be described as a language other than whatever is inside that performance. And I was wondering if you could maybe before we talk about it, to show a clip from that.
Well, I'll talk about it first, and then I'll find a clip to show. I've always had an interest in Dada, which is to say an interest in both the comic grotesque, but also in the absurd. And the absurd, not in the English form of the foolish or the amusing, but the absurd as work that comes out of a distorted logic, a logic that's gone awry, and which then this crazy logic gets followed through to the nth degree. And so in some ways, if one thinks of America in the last 4 years, there's something that only the absurd can begin to match what was actually happening. So it becomes a kind of naturalism. It doesn't become a joke. It becomes a way of revealing what the world is. And with Kurt Schwitter's Ursinate, which is a 30-minute piece of language that doesn't have any meaning, it becomes a very interesting speech about the edge of meaning in language, the edge of language. And he spent many years writing it and then the rest of his life performing it. And I mean, here's a page opening one at random in the text. Fums povota sa u pogif qui e. There doesn't ner ear and pif til till you ka. Rinske de baby in skirmu to ends it to rinskirmu rakete baby. Tick the baby. Rinske de baby. Tick the baby ends a racket the baby ends a tick the baby in skr. Rinske the baby in skr. And so on, for as if you're giving a lecture, or as if you're trying to speak with sense, but it's just unable to come through. I mean, it's written in a sonata form, and it ends with a kind of cadenza, which is to play with as you like. I'll show you a minute of the cadenza, which I invited other performers to join me in. Okay, Chris?
Rinsike the baby, ticket the baby.
Rinsike the baby, racket the baby.
Sukkede baby enza.
Rinzika baby enza. Rakata baby enza.
Sukkede baby ensker.
Rinzika baby ens. Rakata baby ensker.
Sukkede baby ensker moo.
Rinzika baby enskrim new. Rakata baby ensker new.
Sukkede baby ensker mew too.
Rinzika baby enskrim new. Rakata baby ensker.
Sukkede baby ensker mew too. Enza too. Ensker mew. Sukkede baby ensker.
So this was the last few seconds of the performance, in which we had projections accompanying the recitation of the text. So it's me reciting for the first 25 minutes and then a 5-minute cadenza with whoever was in the room at that day. People from the center, I invited them to come and join up, come up to the end, and let's see kind of what happens in a very wild way. Each time I'm about to perform it, before I go on stage, I think, what on earth am I doing here? This is insane. If only I hadn't done this, then I could be having a nice glass of wine and a good meal with friends, instead of having to go and it is repetitive and it is rubbish, but it's kind of wonderful rubbish.
There's a need to perform it without any irony and complete seriousness in order to allow the audience to question this meaning-making process, but then also bizarrely, while you're watching it, you feel like you're imposing a certain type of meaning. It both succeeds at making meaning and confounding meaning.
I mean, there are many different ways. It's interesting. There are some people who do it very musically. There are a lot of jazz musicians who've done it. Then it's done as a kind of piece of music. There's one person with an extraordinary memory who does the whole thing, I think, in 12 minutes. So, then it goes like, like, it goes kind of or it's a kind of question and answer, which is more the way I do it. I discovered very early that I could not remember it. I tried to remember it. And so I have the script when I perform it. And even though as I look at it, it's kind of familiar, but it takes that whole terror of what it is to really be an actor, to remember your lines, to do it.
And it's in a way, the way you've staged it is also operatic or dramatic. I say operatic because of the musical elements, which we didn't see quite as much there in terms of the band that comes on stage. But this way in which you, even before the music, as conventional music accompaniment comes on, the way you've read the text has a musicality. But then you even create conflict between yourself and those who have come onto the stage. And so, in that sense, you could say you're redefining the confines of what the operatic form could also be conceived as. Would you, and kind of pushing against forms constantly, again, it seems to be a preoccupation.
One of the things I failed at without being rescued by it in any way is being able to hold a tune. I'm kind of astonished at the gap between the way I think something should sound and the sound that comes out of my mouth. And even my children, when they were very young, used to beg me, please not to sing, please not to sing. So this kind of recitation is as close to music as I'm going to get. Making and directing opera is as close to kind of conducting as I'm going to get. But there is the opera is kind of wonderful and terrible, as you know. It's there are these most fantastic voices. They're the most extraordinary pieces of music that have been written. In some cases, there are wonderful librettos, but there's a kind of the conundrum of an audience saying, show us something we know. Let's have the 4,900th Norma or La Traviata or the Da Ponte Mozart operas. So give us something that's utterly familiar, but give us something new. And that's kind of the constraint of the bulk of operatic projects in the world. And so for me, when I've worked with opera, it has to be understanding that's one of the constraints, but that within the operas, there are so many themes that are possible to explore, whether it's the unstable nature of desire in Lulu or the violent spread of desperation in Wozzeck, or the nature of the absurd in Shostakovich's The Nose, that the opera also becomes the starting point of a larger exploration, both in the opera house and beyond it. I mean, I can think of the two ways. Either you can think of yourself as a director who's hired by an opera house to direct that opera that they want to do that season. I like to think of it rather that I'm making a drawing and I've been given this canvas, which is 17 meters wide and 12 meters high. And not only that, the opera house gives me a whole orchestra to accompany this drawing, which they put in the pit with a wonderful conductor and 8 of the best voices in the world to go along with it, and a story that will be told. And I think of it as a kind of drawing in 4 dimensions that makes its way across the time and the stage. But it is also an opera in an opera house.
You have, in going back to the Ursonata, the animations that are on the stage are taken from other works as well that you've done, and this kind of way in which, to those who know your oeuvre, there's a kind of palimpsestic aspect that connects to your drawings as well, in the sense of being able to see the erasures. If you don't know your oeuvre, we don't have that connections. But I'm curious, talking about opera as well as being this most excessive and expensive art form, that whether or not you think about artists as being in a privileged position of having an audacious advantage of being able to try things out in public and see what you can't do that if you're in another field. You can't necessarily, if you're running a business, you can't automatically say, let's try this out, and if my company goes bankrupt, we start again. But there's a difference every night with every audience, and I'm curious how that plays.
I mean, for me, I'm constantly aware of and grateful to what was made possible by the Dadaists 105 years ago, where in their attempt to say, let's make not art, let's make something that is not art, that can't be done, they shattered the confines and also what the audience would accept as being the work of an artist. So whether, and in the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich in 1916, suddenly a visual artist, his drawing was reciting a poem or a piece of music or a performance, an outrageous performance, or finding an object on the street and putting it in front of you and saying, this is my artwork, whether it's a urinal of Duchamp or other objects that other people found. And what that means, that within the world of being a visual artist, all things are possible. It's possible for me to say, my project for this week is the Ursonata. It's much harder and people will give it the benefit of the doubt, or give it the time of day. They'll be prepared to look at it, or this directing of the piece of theater. It would be much harder for a poet to say, oh, my poem today is this painting I'm doing, or the poem I'm publishing, it just happens to be this piece of music. So in that sense, there is a privilege which doesn't have to do with finance, that privilege. That's the kind of space that's been carved out through hard work of the Dadaists and those who followed them. It's the origin of the conceptualists, it's the origin of so many different kinds of work that happen within the broad field of the visual arts. And it was kind of understanding that luxury that made the center a necessary institution to say, this is the freedom which is offered to you if you are an artist, and it should be there for all other performers also, for other artists in different forms, whatever they're doing. There is, I think, an excess for me, it's important, the excess of the studio. The fact that different projects and different thoughts can happen at the same time, and that on the walls of the studio, there are different projects which are beginning in middle stages. And whether they're small or ambitious or small, there's a kind of peripheral vision and a peripheral thinking that goes with it, of allowing ideas to emerge. And in that, the studio of the artist, the physical studio, is an important, not just metaphor for one's headspace, but a demonstration of ways of thinking and making, which do, in the case of grand opera, get expanded and done with all the resources that an opera house needs to have to do traditional grand opera. I mean, there are many ways of doing opera much more simply. You know, there's chamber opera literally done in people's sitting rooms with 3 instruments and 4 singers. There's some which are halfway between, where you might have a small choir and a chamber orchestra and performers. They shift and expand. I mean, the resources thrown at opera are tiny compared to the resources thrown at movies, and even more minuscule compared to the resources thrown at computer games. It's not that, compared though to what it is to make a drawing in your studio on a sheet of paper. Of course, it's extraordinarily extravagant.
That there's a paradox though with the existence of this excess in this closed space, which you often have closed spaces in a lot of your theatrical works and non-theatrical works, whether it's the hotel room that Trotsky was in Istanbul, or the stagings from The Nose, or other works that you've done, and this ways in which, you know, both within this enclosed space, it can push out through this excess. There's and that kind of interplay of pushing someone into a form, actually, in another way of thinking about it, that the productiveness of the constrictions of a form, which I think you've worked against productively in so many ways.
So I think there are ways in which a project can expand what one expects it to be. So for example, the song cycles that I've worked with, either with paper music, a song cycle written by Philip Miller, or the Winterreise, the Schubert one, in which usually traditionally you'd have a piano and a singer, and that's what you're watching. But to these 24 songs of the Schubert song cycle, or the 17 songs of paper music, a film was made for each song. So you're both watching and listening. And there is always a kind of overload when you're asking someone to watch and listen at the same time. And, you know, if people get confounded by too much to watch, they resist and they stop hearing, or they close their eyes. But there is something about the excess of what it is to be moving through the world anyway, whoever you are, under whatever circumstances, where you are always having to construct both yourself and the world every day, to take all the fragments of the phone calls, what you've seen on the news, what the emails that you've read, your memory of the night before, the conversation you've promised to have someone in 3 days' time. And from these, make a selection of fragments and put those fragments together, both to make who you are, which is an ongoing process which we're usually very aware of, and also to make sense of the world. And what the work in the studio does is kind of make that apparent. You're aware of this construction of an image, whether it's a collage or a piece of opera. You're aware of the artificiality of it, which is to say you're aware of the agency demanded of you as a viewer to complete it. And so the excess sometimes is about making that conscious, making that clear and unavoidable.
You're not interested in a lazy audience, in other words. The audience at your productions can't just sit back.
The one thing I've learned is not to try to think on behalf of the audience. So I can't ever think, what will an audience accept? What will they not accept? I have to do it. Here are the 8 people I'm working with, or the 10 people I'm working with. We watch it together and try to work out the dosages. Does it feel too busy? Does it feel, are we losing the plot? Is this essential? Is it not essential? And on the basis that if it works for us, the hope is that it will work for enough people outside of the studio. And that to try to think in a kind of patronizing way, we know more, so let us decide what somebody else can understand. You always get it wrong. People understand more and less than you expect. But the one thing I don't expect is a kind of purity of vision where you can pick up everything and follow every strain of everything you're seeing, because that's not how we work. We always are held by some moment, and that expands in our head, and that reminds us of something. Even while you're watching a performance, your mind is constantly picking memories and images up and feeding them onto the performance that you're seeing or the drawing that you're seeing. It's always kind of a meeting the world halfway. The production or the drawing comes towards you, and what comes towards it from you are all your associations with what you're seeing and what you're hearing. So excess is kind of important,
One line that came to mind, or one continuation of a line that came to mind when I was revisiting so much of your work this week was, as loath as I am to quote Donald Rumsfeld, but the famous line that he had about known knowns and known knowns and known unknowns. But the one he doesn't mention, and Slavoj Žižek talks about this as well, is unknown knowns, things that we don't know that we know. And
I think that's the vital one, because the principle of working, both in the center with the looking for the less good idea, finding the less good idea, and working with this kind of excess, is relying on the capacity for recognition, for something sparking an echo in your head that you see. So you may not know how to draw a horse rearing on its hind legs, but if you arrange little pieces of paper in the shape of a horse, you arrange them and suddenly you'll recognize, oh, that looks like a horse rearing on its hind legs. Or you look at clouds and, oh, that looks like an old man's face. Even if you couldn't draw an old man's face, doesn't mean you can't recognize it as it comes towards you. And that would be one of the unknown knowns, which are vital and central in how we go through the world.
And you've, in another presentation you gave recently, this, I think, to connect this to the present moment of why you said that now is actually a bad time for artists in a certain sense, that making work needing to become from the materials in the process, rather than, I can imagine there are some theater directors, to keep it onto the theater aspect, who want to make the COVID play, or to do the thing that is so explicit, so polemical and too obvious. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts about what resisting that. I mean, doing Wozzeck and Lulu today is, relevant in a way that people would not obviously expect, whereas somebody thinks that the COVID play or the Trump play needs to be done. But I feel like
yes, I mean, I think there are some people for whom that would be the spark that would make wonderful work happen or bad work happen. It's not to say that that starting point is necessarily wrong. Just temperamentally for me, it needs to cook in a slightly different way. And that when I start with, okay, here's the big theme, how do we explore that theme? I get stuck. Okay, Trump. Write it again, Trump, underline it. To say. Whereas if one starts from something much more idiosyncratic, a particular image, a particular thought, and follows that, you may discover that in the end, the work you're making has many other sets of association. We did a piece which was shown in New York 2 years ago, The Head and the Load, about Africa in the First World War. But it started being an expansion of Wozzeck, and then it became a piece about a shadow procession moving across the stage. And then we thought about, did it be about the porters in Africa trying to discover that history that we've never known? And at some point, some critic wrote saying this is an extremely strong anti-war play, the strongest anti-war play he'd seen. And we were kind of looked at ourselves and we said, never in the year that we were making the piece did that, making the play, not the piece, did that phrase ever cross anybody's lips. It was not a thought that we had. Is this an anti-war play? Is this a pro-war play? It was so not a topic. But having made the piece, he was right, that the vehemence against what was happening turns it into a kind of anti-war play. So I'm interested in the way, starting at the edge, you may find a larger theme. But for me, it doesn't really help often if you start with the big. It became a piece very much about the nature of colonialism, which was, again, never a word that we were thinking about at the beginning. It became irresistible because every association we had brought elements of that into the work. And in a way, the work was telling us what its subject would be rather than us giving an instruction to the work at the beginning.
There was I think you may have said this kind of necessary for you not to have known all the facts about everything that happened in terms of Africa and the First World War in this particular case of the head and the load. It's a non-lecture, to go back to the lecture theme.
During the piece, while making the production, we had a big thought saying, people, this is going to be so vague. No one knows what this is about. You better have a lecture in the middle that tells you, this is the First World War, this is where it was fought, this is what happened in Africa, this was the Congress of Berlin. And we kind of held to our guns of not doing that. And in the end, people seemed to understand the history as well as the theatricality of it.
Would you say it's a difference between...
The other thing I want to say about that is that ignorance was a good starting point. It wasn't if I thought at the beginning, I know so much about the subject, this is what I'm going to tell other people. The piece was provoked by me not knowing so much. And more than that, my frustration and annoyance at myself saying, here's someone, I've studied colonial history, I've lived in South Africa, I should know these things. What is it that has constructed this ignorance in me? And some of that ignorance is a deliberate ignorance on the part of colonial powers of not wanting to acknowledge what Africans had done in the First World War and hiding that history. So it's a constructed ignorance. But there are other ignorances in which I was much more complicit in being so delighted by the romance of the war poets, of the English war poets, of All Quiet on the Western Front, that even though I know there was Gallipoli and there was the Asia Minor, the war there, still my head was filled with the Western Front. So that's something I knew but wouldn't acknowledge. And then there was even when I knew that was there, the relative weight different things were given is so shaped by childhood, by what one reads early on, by the films you've seen, that to undo that structure was part of the work of the making of the piece, of the play, of the opera.
And then I guess also for the audience, this kind of undoing for their, I guess, a hope potentially of undoing of their own preconceptions of this.
I mean, I'm sure that, well, certainly in South Africa, in English in an English ex-colony, post-colony of Britain, Wilfred Owen, what passing bells for these who die as cattle, only the monstrous rifles, rapid rattle, can patter out their hasty orisons, the kind of words that sit in one's head. So one of the things we said, well, let's take that poem and actually, almost Google translate it into French, mistranslate it, and then have someone saying it in French, but forgetting it. Quel cloche qui sonne comme des bêtes, and playing with that confusion of what it might be. Because, of course, the poems that we know of the First World War, those in South Africa with the British war poets, but none of the songs of the African conscripts and African porters that were involved. And it's always trying to discover, to acknowledge one's own limitations and ignorances.
The audience's limitations, and maybe this could be the last theme that we discuss before we open it up to questions, but something which is a large topic, but this idea of magic in the theater, and about magic in particular, but also the ways in which you've talked about this a lot, but I'm curious in a specific theatrical context of the audience, when somebody watches a magician, they know that what they're saying is a trick, and yet there is a joy, there is something wonderful about seeing the magic. Nevertheless, there's a suspension of disbelief that you have to have in that aspect. But I'm curious, for example, with puppetry, that you've worked with the Handspring Puppet Company and a lot of work with puppets before, that you see the puppeteer in the production as well as the puppet, and in works like Ubu and the Truth Commission, you're dealing with something which is incredibly serious as well as comic in the way that you've written, in the way that you've produced it. You didn't write that, but directed that. That I'm curious if theater broadly, that we know that this is an actor, we know that this is somebody who's not actually Hamlet or a character in The Head and the Load, that the Kaiser, how this element of magic and suspension of belief towards a kind of transcendence or towards a kind of understanding plays through, whether that's a success. I'm curious how you would think of that as succeeding or not, or being productive in its not succeeding, if that makes sense.
I think that's central to what one does if you're making a drawing, if you're making a piece of theater, or in its most emblematic form, if you're doing a magic trick. A story which I've described before, but which I'll describe again, was when I was a student, going to see a tiny circus in Paris, La Cirque Imaginaire, and which had two people in it. I think one was Charlie Chaplin's daughter, and they had one semi-trained goose, and they did a series of acts. But there was one remarkable act, which was a man turning soap into glass. So he had a soap bubble, he had a stick with a ring, and he would blow soap bubbles, and there'd be all these bubbles floating in the air. And then from his waistcoat, he took a hammer, a little hammer, and he shattered each bubble. But the extraordinary thing is that they were actually made of glass, and you would hear each one shatter as he hit them. And after a while, he sort of lifted his waistcoat, and you saw that in fact his other thumb was holding a little bell that was attached to his trousers. And each time he hit a bubble, he simply tinged the bell, and the bell was making the sound of the glass shattering. So the illusion was completely shown, that you could see, oh, you know it's bubbles, soap bubbles being blown. You see them being popped. You see the sound being made by the bell. But still you could not stop believing that those bubbles were made of glass. So that you were completely held by the illusion, even knowing how it was done. And then the key thing, I think, for me, is that you then step behind yourself and you watch yourself being fooled, knowing that you're seeing both soap and glass, and the pleasure you take in your own self-deception. That sense of understanding your complicity in making that illusion. And it's the same way when you look at an old master painting, and as you go close, the beautiful lace that Velasquez has painted suddenly turns into very distinct, clear brush marks when you're very close. And you step back, and at a certain point, the brush marks turn back into lace. And there's both the awareness of the artistry and the artifice, but a pleasure in being held by it. And the same when you watch an actor. You're watching someone pretending to be someone else. And it's not that you pretend not to notice. Sometimes you are unable to stop yourself from being held by that illusion.
And that seems to be perhaps, and push against this, and as maybe a last statement in terms of the theatrical, that's a different kind of shock and a different kind of transcendence to provoke in the audience than, or to compel the audience towards, than say something like the riot that took place after Ubuwa's original production. That no one, as far as I'm aware, no one has rioted or done any sort of collapse after any of your productions of any sort. That you don't seem to be the type of push that.
Yeah, I don't think that's not my nature. It's a different kind of aha moment or revelation. It's also hard to imagine a riot after a performance that's not a kind of self-conscious riot in echo of the Paris, after Ubuwa in 1896, or the Dadaists in 1916. I'm sure there are performances that do it, but that's never been a kind of an aim.
Well, I think that some of our questioners have an aim with what they would like to ask, so maybe we can open up the floor.
Great. Yes, we have tons of questions flooding in. And I am going to moderate it by passing the mic theoretically around the audience, beginning with Clara. Clara, I'm going to give you the mic.
Yes, hello. I was wondering if you read poetry and contemporary poetry, and if yes, Who are your favorite poets?
I do read poetry, not nearly as much as my wife, who is a doctor, who often prescribes poems to her patients, and she reads them all the time. But there are many poets, both contemporary and recently dead or dead for hundreds of years, that I'm a great fan of a lot of Polish poets, whether it's Zagajewski, who just died a few weeks ago, or Wisława Szymborska, and from Milosz, all of those, that great Polish poetic tradition that goes back. Of course, the Beowulf of Seamus Heaney and other poems are fantastic, and many others that get given to me to read by my wife, which are remarkable, but I'm a complete have a non-memory for the specific names of them. But I do. And what I do, I have a book of words, and there are odd phrases and there are odd insights which sometimes come in different lines of poets, and I kind of keep a collection which sometimes emerge into drawings, different works. The libretto of the chamber opera Waiting for the Sibyl are large, sort of a mixture of phrases that I've written, mixture of African proverbs, and phrases from a range of, whether it's a phrase of Yehuda Amichai or a Finnish poet or an Inuit poet in translation, kind of sometimes transformed, sometimes not so transformed. So yes, poetry is a kind of vital as a way of thinking about language, thinking in language.
Thank you so much. Beautiful. So next I'm going to pass the mic to Susan. Susan L. You should be able to catch it from me now.
I'm not sure which of my questions you've chosen for me to talk about. I guess I was really taken with the collaborative work that you're doing there in South Africa and your description about the process that was used with the group. I would love to see that happening all over this country at this point. But I have a couple of things. And I had only a little bit of time to review some of your work before this. But one of the things I had made a note of in your use of language, because language is so much, rather than language, I would say even words. So it was just interesting when you just said you have a book of words, because that's what comes through in your work, to me at least, is you had in something I saw earlier today, a text that you had written of where shall we place our hope, with the question mark. Where shall we place our hope? And that, just out of all the notes I was taking from looking at your work, that's the one that grabbed me the strongest after hearing you speak. And you were speaking about the part of what you've shared with us is the whole idea of strands. You didn't use the word weaving, but you did use the word strands, and how the different strands come together in this collaborative working that you do. You also alluded to that as to what happens in your studio, in your own space, your physical space and mind in the space of your studio, but then that is translated out into your work with others, which was a beautiful parallel that I appreciated. So of course I can talk, so I'm going to pull myself back, and I'm going to pull it back to what about where shall we place our hope? I'm not bringing that question out here for you to give us an answer.
Good, very good.
That's not why I'm bringing it up. I'm bringing it up because I think it's an essential question. Talk about the unthought knowns. Because everyone, there's 160 people here on this Zoom, and everyone has hopes and dreams. Everyone is trying to imagine something beyond the present realities. But as a creator and someone who works in collaboration, what could you imagine as far as something that happens, let's say, here in New York City or in the United States, or, I mean, you've been doing it in South Africa, really sort of a global movement to ask, where do we place our hope?
Well, I mean, that's as you said, I'm not able to give you an answer to that, but I will say I'm working on a series of films about what happens in the studio. And the last one still to be made is they're all on different themes, on fate, on memory, on different things like that. But the last one will be called, I think, A Defense of Optimism. And the optimism that I'll be talking about is the sense of agency you get in making, in my case, in a studio, both individually and collaboratively. The sense of energy and possibility in the world, even if it's only something that's going to stay in the studio or be on a small stage or be shown in an exhibition or something like that. Nonetheless, there's a kind of proto-demonstration of how one could be in the world and how, I mean, in South Africa, as you can imagine, it's an extremely complicated and painfully unequal and divided society, even now, all these 2.5 decades after the end of apartheid and the start of democracy. But there's a kind of utopian possibility in those moments of people coming together in the studio. After the work in the studio, lives are still very different. For some participants, they're extremely difficult. They're at the edge of destitution. Other people are very comfortably off. There are enormous differences. But in the process of working, there's a human openness to what someone else is giving you and what you can offer back in terms of a gesture, a sound, a movement, an image. And I mean, that is my community, the community of other artists and people working in this way. And that is where I place the hope. And that is where it's also placed metaphorically.
Beautiful, thank you.
Thank you very much. GE, I'm passing you the mic for your question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep, that's good.
Okay, good. Yes, thank you very much. I've always seen your work as so wonderfully informed by things like by people like co-curates and Goya, and I was wondering, could you please talk about your work, as I kind of see it as a sympathetic melancholy, that which sometimes is fearful for the sake of all our others.
You're right to mention both co-curates, who was very central for me when I was a student to see it, and Goya, who day by day continues to be kind of vitally sitting somewhere over my shoulder as a model of how one can think about the world and work particularly with graphic techniques. So you're right with that. Someone once asked, someone was making a film about the work I was doing, and they had the foolishness to interview my daughter about the work. And she was very reluctant to participate. But in her sort of semi-adolescent way, they said, well, why do you think your father's work is so melancholy? Why is his work so dark? And she said, well, he works with charcoal, doesn't he? And there is something about that. The work comes out of, it's not as if I start with an emotion. You know, there may be a gathering of an atmosphere at the end, but it's with the technique of charcoal drawing or animation or different techniques. And I was delighted once when somebody did an exhibition which was putting my work together with Buster Keaton. It was etchings of Goya, films of Buster Keaton and films and drawings of mine. And suddenly I thought, oh boy, I must go and relook at Buster Keaton and see how he does it. And it's true, now Buster Keaton sits in my head more than he had before.
And of course, Keaton and Beckett. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
But Beckett, we must remember, is a comic writer. For all the desperation, it only works because it also has all the timing and the sparseness and the wit of a great comic writer, in which he follows other great Irish writers, whether it's Flann O'Brien or James Joyce or Oscar Wilde and George Bernard Shaw. The understanding that comedy is vital for actually dealing with big themes.
Thank you very much. We will go to one more audience question. And Deborah, you had a question which flows quite nicely from this one about the medium of charcoal. You should be getting a prompt. Hi.
Hello, yes. Can you hear me?
Indeed, yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, yeah. I was just curious as to whether you see yourself continuing to work in charcoal now that you've found that medium and that seems to convey what you're trying to convey in your work well, or whether you might just pick up, say, I don't know, acrylic or pebbles and start doing a completely different medium in the future.
Yes, in fact, at the moment, this week, so to speak, most of the work I'm doing is with ink, is with Indian ink on paper, many panels, painting things. But the big project I've done in the last year was an animated film, which still 30 years on, we're still using the charcoal technique. In the series of films about the studio, there's a mixture of sculpture, charcoal drawings, ink drawings, not so much oil paint, not so much color, but a lot of different monochromatic techniques and a range of different graphic techniques, from etching to woodcuts to lithographs. It has to be a medium in which you can think. And when I was painting in color, it was always about, does this look nice? Does it not look nice? As opposed to, is this a way of actually allowing a thought to develop? And for me, that by default was somehow has tended largely to be either charcoal or ink.
Oh, okay. To add to that, do you see black and white as having a timeless quality? Because that's something I find comes across in your work for me personally.
I don't think it has a timeless quality, but it has obviously echoes to other black and white forms, which is to, firstly, the history of printmaking, of lithography, of in which, a colored print is now fairly common, but it's a kind of anomaly within the history of printmaking. And there's a connection between printmaking and printed text, of movable text, and even of manuscript work. So there's a way in which drawing and writing are very close together, more than painting for me. So I think it has references also. Obviously, charcoal drawing has references to black and white photography, which still continues now, even though it has a greater echo to previous decades than at the moment. So it has echoes rather than any claim to timelessness.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Lynn Crawford, I'm going to hand you the mic to bring us full circle to where we started this conversation.
Actually, it is. Thank you. There's a line I thought when you I recalled when you started talking from one of my favorite, very prolific writers, Thomas Bernhard. You might be familiar with him. And the line is, after all, there's nothing but failure. But it's clearly a humorous, it's used in a humorous context. I mean, he was a very prolific writer. And I kept thinking about that.
But the thing about the Thomas Bernhard, after everything, there's nothing but failure. He was a complete misery. He was such a misanthrope. He hated everyone and everything so much, brilliantly, as opposed to Beckett. I can't go on, I must go on, I fail again, fail better. There's something about failing better that's much more optimistic than saying there's nothing but failure. The sense that there are no good solutions, but there are certainly less bad ones.
Yeah. I mean, the irony of that is he kept writing. You know, he kept at it. He kept writing. He
did keep at it. He
so
did
it's
keep
almost
at
like
it.
he was
He did
making
keep
fun
at
of
it.
himself in a way, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. He is a wonderful writer. Yeah.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, William. I now have the pleasure of handing the mic to our own publisher, Phong Bui.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, William. Thank you, Charles. It's a marvelous conversation. I learned so much in the last one you did with Anne McCoy, also for the Brooklyn Rail. So this is terrific following up. And you kept insistent on the idea of Kundera, incredible essay, reminded me so much. You're right, it was published in New Yorker magazine in 2007, where he talked about the idea of maximum diversity in minimal space. You know, the idea where world literature, there are two different contexts that I remembered well, in which a work of art can or may belong, either in history of its own context, and own nation, which he prefer to a certain form of provincialism, or in the world literature. You know, so in other words, I can't remember that well, but Rabelais is underappreciated in his own native French spoken, you know, in France, but he's better understood and celebrated by Bakhtin in Russia, although Dostoevsky was less admired in Russia than he was in France, mostly by André Gide. So it goes along with the same idea, William, because when you mentioned Beckett had learned how to write in France, and he left Ireland to follow his mentor, soon to be his boss, working as an assistant for quite some time, James Joyce. And the same idea that how, for example, similarly, someone like Kafka learned how to write in German, not in Czech, for the same reason. So I can understand that incredible difficulty, level of difficulty, but you're absolutely right when you talk about failure. We need to celebrate mistranslation, misinterpretation, misreading, all of which are some form and shapes of, I would say, imperfection. You know, that imperfection, it needs to be celebrated. For some reason, I think there's a tendency in this culture, at least in the US in the last several decades, you get definitely, you get torture for being imperfect. You know, failure is not celebrated. You have to be perfect. You know, the whole idea of to study something, to be specialized in one field. I love the way you describe in your studio, you see things in the periphery, you know, or things that's around and you work simultaneously at the same time. And my feeling was that I remember clearly, since you talk about Café Voltaire, I can't help but to think of Carl Valentin. You remember, William? The great cabaret performer, metaphysical, exactly, film producer, writer. So much of your work remind me of his work too. And I remember once growing up, I was told a story where he was performing on the stage, which the stage set was supposed to be 2, 3 in the morning in the park, public park, where he dressed like a beggar and he would walk around the stage where the lights are at the edge of the stage. And he kept walking for a good 5-10 minutes. And then the policeman appeared and he said to him, "What are you doing in the middle of the night in the park, sir?" He said, "I'm looking for my keys." So the policeman said, "Well, let me help you then." So the two of them walk around in silence for another 10 minutes or so. And finally, he stopped the beggar and he said, "You sure?" The policeman says, "You sure you lost your keys here, sir?" He say, no, I think I lost them over there. And he point to the audience where the dog is. So the policeman say to him, why not looking over there then? He say, there's no light over there, sir. So when you talk about failure, I think failure is so identical to sense of courage. And I think for some reason, you know, we have tendency to look for answer all the time. We forget that providing the question is what we do best as creative individuals. And I remember when I was teaching both art teaching and also teaching writing at the same time. And most of my friends or my students ask me, why do you teach art? I say, I don't teach art. I can't teach art. But what I can teach is how you can look at things or how you can see things. The same thing with writing. How do you teach writing? I don't teach writing. I teach people how to read, what book to read. That's all you can do. So failure is essential. And we should be courageous to pursue it, to experience that. So I thank you so much for this profound conversation, really. And very happy to have you here. It's so nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and see you very soon. Can't wait to see your show. So congratulations on your show too, William.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll take this moment to just read one of the very happy remarks from the chat from Annie Cooper. Your words, William Kentridge, today speak of life, beyond art, within art, throughout art, the art of life, of us, of humans, of growth, of potential, of all. Thank you for bringing yourself so authentically, completely, and truly to us here today. I'm grateful for this experience. And so, without further ado, we will move to the poetry. As promised, we have Kit Schluter here today, who's coming to us from Mexico City. A poet, translator, and bookmaker, Kit Schluter's poetry and stories have appeared in tons of publications and frequently in the pages of the Brooklyn Rail. His book of poems, Pierrot's Fingernails, was recently published by Canarium Books. Kit, I'm going to pass you the mic.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that incredibly lucid conversation, William and Charles. I felt almost like I was reading Francis Bacon's interviews in the way that reflections on art speak to life as well, and to a kind of philosophy of living. I'm here on my couch with my dog sleeping here beside me. She's black, so you might not be able to see her. Anyhow, we are comfortable in the living room. So instead of reading poems, which I was tasked with, I thought about what work of mine might go best with William's work. And so I found a story that I wrote one night after reading a book called The Autobiography of Death recently. And it fits into a series I'm writing of cartoons, verbal cartoons that I see the cartoon as kind of the fairy tale of today, in how it expresses subconscious ideas in a way that's fun and accessible across the age groups. So this cartoon, or this fable, is called The Children of Heaven. The man may well have eaten the milk cow, but the milk cow had eaten the grass, and in the grass was hiding the woman whom the milk cow ate by accident. And so, when the sun was setting and the man was digesting the milk cow, as well as the woman and the grass that were inside its belly, the man began to feel quite sick. He sat on his couch and moaned and moaned. The woman punched at the insides of his stomach and screamed about death. Purple flowers in a pot on the table turned orange. The window blew open in the wind. The curtains blew out the window like two arms reaching toward the sun. The man collapsed on his kitchen table and the woman burst out of his stomach with her fist held high. She dragged him by the hair to his own doorway, placed his head against the door frame, and closed the door repeatedly upon his temple. The milk cow tumbled out of his stomach, laughing vengefully. The woman began to cry. The man groaned and fell into a deep sleep. When the man woke up, he was in the hospital of heaven, recovering from surgery, and his stomach was wide open. Inside it, he saw a beautiful field with a milk cow grazing and a woman hiding in the grass. He called for the doctor to come see. "Doctor, what do you see in my stomach?" "I see hunger," said the doctor. And the man said, "Bring me a plate of food, doctor. I'm ready to eat." "Now, isn't that wonderful news?" the doctor replied. "You're healing right up." A nurse brought in a plate of lightly salted children. She placed a chocolate beside them and wished the man a good meal. A child with terrible burns across her whole body was pushed by in a wheelchair. The window blew open in the wind. The curtains streamed out the window like the pigtails of a running girl. A pot of white flowers fell out the window and broke in the garden below. The man had never eaten children before, so he poked at them curiously with his fork for quite some time before he began to bring them to his mouth. They giggled when he stabbed them and told him, "Yes, yes, that is exactly how to eat a child. We live to feed the grown-ups, just like you." Soon the children were walking all around the inside of his mouth and swimming around at the very bottom of his belly. He enjoyed their company and regaled them with stories of his own youth, and they giggled along, and they reenacted the scenes. The doctor returned with good news. The man had survived, and he could go back to life now. But he decided to stay in heaven, where he could eat children for every meal. But soon after he had made his decision, he discovered that while the children did provide him good company, they could never satisfy his hunger because they always crawled back out of his mouth while he was asleep. And the doctor laughed when the man told him this, as if he had observed this revelation countless times before, and he lit a white candle in the darkness of the night. And that is the end of my tale.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
The room is resounding with snaps and claps. Thank you very much for that beautiful pairing. And thank you, William. Thank you, Charles. It's been such a pleasure to have you both. And I speak for the whole audience when I say that. We are celebrating our 20th anniversary at the Rail. So if you enjoyed today's event and you want to keep our paper and our events free and accessible, consider making a donation through a link in the chat. And we do hold these events every day. So tune in tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation between artist Carrie Moyer and writer, Rail superstar, Malvika Jolly. You can now turn on your mic if you would like to say goodbye on your way out.
Happy birthday, William.
Bye.
Thanks, William.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Charles.
Bye. It was wonderful.
Thank you, William.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, William.
Marvelous.
Good. Pleasure.
A whole lifetime.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Beautiful story too.
Thank you so much for your words, Annie.
Thank you. It was amazing. It was wonderful. Thank you. It was amazing. Operatic cacophony.
Friends from all over the world shouting their goodbyes.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Kit. Get some fun.
Wonderful, everyone. Enjoy your lunch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.